I watched my daughter hand a $20,000 ring to another woman, and then she handed me a $5 piece of plastic. I didn't say anything. I didn't even let my smile slip. It was Mother's Day, after all, and the restaurant was filled with soft piano music, polished silverware, and the kind of warm lighting that made everything look more beautiful than it really was. Emily had chosen the place herself, one of those upscale spots by the waterfront where the menus don't list prices and the servers speak in low, careful tones. She said she wanted to make the day special. I believed her. I even wore the pearl necklace my late husband gave me 20 years ago, the one I only brought out for important occasions. I thought this would be one of them. The table was already full when I arrived. Emily stood up to greet me with a quick hug, her perfume light and unfamiliar, something expensive I didn't recognize. Daniel gave me a polite nod from his seat, and Patricia, his mother, sat at the center of it all, glowing. There was something different about the way Emily looked at her, a softness, a kind of admiration I couldn't remember seeing directed at me in years. I took my seat quietly, smoothing the napkin over my lap as conversations flowed around me, laughter rising and falling like I was listening from the other side of a wall. Then Emily stood up again, tapping her glass gently. "I just want to take a moment to celebrate an incredible woman," she said, her voice bright, practiced. She turned toward Patricia, her smile widening. "You've been such a blessing in my life." The server brought out a small velvet box, deep navy, placed carefully in Emily's hands. I felt my fingers tighten slightly around my water glass. Emily opened it slowly, revealing a diamond ring that caught the light in a way that made the entire table go quiet for a second. Even I had to admit, it was stunning. "Oh my goodness," someone whispered. Patricia covered her mouth, eyes shining. "Emily, you didn't. It's just a little something," Emily said, laughing softly, as if $20,000 was nothing more than a thoughtful gesture. "And there's also a cruise booked for you and Dad this summer." The table erupted in applause. Glasses clinked. Daniel leaned over to kiss his mother's cheek. Patricia looked overwhelmed, grateful, cherished. I clapped too. Of course I did. My hands moved on their own, steady, polite, invisible. Then Emily turned to me. "And Mom," she said, reaching for a small gift bag by her chair, "I got you something too." The bag was light, almost weightless. I opened it carefully, pulling out a thin plastic bracelet, the kind you might find in a discount bin near a checkout counter. It was pale pink, with a tiny charm glued to the center. "It's symbolic," Emily added quickly. "You know, something sweet." I nodded. I smiled. I even thanked her. No one at the table seemed to notice the difference. Or maybe they did, and just chose not to see it. I slipped the bracelet onto my wrist, the plastic cool against my skin, and rested my hands back in my lap. Across from me, Patricia was still admiring her ring, turning her hand under the light, everyone leaning in to admire it. And in that moment, surrounded by people, laughter, and celebration, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to see before. I wasn't her priority. I wasn't even her second thought. I was something else entirely. I kept smiling long after everyone else had moved on, long after the waiter cleared the dessert plates and refilled the water glasses that no one at the table really needed anymore. Because it was easier than explaining why my hands felt so still in my lap, why that thin plastic bracelet seemed heavier than anything I had worn in years, and no one noticed. Or maybe they did, and simply chose not to look too closely. Because the conversation had already shifted back to Patricia, to her upcoming cruise, to the destinations she would visit, to the suite Emily had booked for her with a private balcony overlooking the ocean, and I listened as if I were hearing a story meant for someone else entirely, nodding at the right moments, offering small polite smiles, while something quiet and cold settled into place inside me, something that did not feel like anger or sadness, but more like clarity, the kind that comes when you finally stop trying to explain away what is right in front of you. And as I sat there, I began to notice things I had overlooked before, small details that suddenly felt sharper, more defined. Like how Emily leaned in every time Patricia spoke, how she reached across the table to adjust her napkin or refill her glass. Gestures I remembered from years ago when Emily used to do those same things for me without being asked. How Daniel watched his mother with open pride while barely glancing in my direction except out of obligation. How even the way the table was arranged placed Patricia at the center while I sat slightly off to the side, close enough to be included, but not enough to matter. And I wondered how long this had been happening, how many moments I had quietly dismissed as coincidence or misunderstanding. Because it is easier to believe that your child is busy, that life is complicated, that relationships change, than it is to accept that you have slowly been moved out of the center of her world and replaced by someone else. And I thought about the past year, about the calls that had grown shorter, the visits that had become less frequent, the way holidays were now rotated between families, but somehow always seemed to favor Daniel's side. And I remembered the last Thanksgiving when Emily told me they would stop by after dinner, but never did, the Christmas when my gift was mailed instead of delivered in person, the birthday card that arrived 3 days late with a printed message instead of her handwriting. Each moment small on its own, easy to forgive, easy to explain. But together they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. And as the waiter brought the check and placed it discreetly near Daniel, I watched as Emily reached for it instead, laughing lightly as she insisted on covering everything, saying it was her treat, that it was the least she could do for such an important day. And I thought about the years I had spent working double shifts, saving every extra dollar to make sure Emily had everything she needed, the school trips I paid for, the college tuition I helped cover, the small apartment I moved into after my husband passed so that I would not be a burden. And I realized that somewhere along the way, my role in her life had quietly shifted from essential to optional, from someone she needed to someone she could acknowledge when it was convenient. And I did not feel the urge to confront her, not there, not in that room filled with soft music and polite laughter, because this was not a moment that could be fixed with a conversation or an apology. This was something deeper, something that had been building for a long time. And as we all stood to leave, and Emily hugged Patricia a little longer than she hugged me, promising to call her the next day to finalize the cruise details, I adjusted the bracelet on my wrist, the cheap plastic catching the light for just a second, and I understood that this was not about the price of a gift. It was about what it revealed, about where I stood, about who I had become in my own daughter's life. And for the first time, I stopped trying to convince myself that I still knew the answer. I drove home that night with the bracelet still on my wrist, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel as the city lights blurred past the windshield, and I realized I had not turned on the radio, had not reached for any kind of distraction, because the silence felt more honest than anything else, more fitting somehow. And when I pulled into my driveway, the house greeted me the same way it always did, quiet, unchanged, waiting, a place that still held every version of the life I had built. Before things began to shift in ways I did not fully understand at the time, and I sat in the car for a moment longer than necessary, looking down at that thin piece of plastic, turning my wrist slightly so it caught the porch light. And I thought about how carefully I had chosen Emily's gift earlier that week, how I had walked through 3 different stores before finding the one thing I believed she would truly like. A leather-bound journal with her initials embossed in gold, something personal, something meaningful, because I still believed those things mattered. And I remembered how her face had lit up when she was younger over the smallest gestures, a handwritten note, a homemade cake, a surprise visit after school, and I wondered when that changed, or if it had always been changing slowly, and I had simply refused to see it. And I finally stepped out of the car, locking it behind me, the sound echoing faintly in the still evening air, and as I walked inside, I placed my purse on the kitchen counter, slipped off my shoes, and moved through the familiar motions of ending a long day. But nothing about it felt routine anymore, not after what I had seen, what I had finally allowed myself to understand, and I poured a glass of water, taking a slow sip as I leaned against the counter, my eyes drifting to the refrigerator where a photo of Emily from her college graduation was still held in place by a small magnet, her smile bright, proud, directed at me from a time when I had no doubt about my place in her life. And I stepped closer, touching the edge of the photo lightly, as if confirming it was still real, that those years had existed the way I remembered them. And that was when another memory surfaced, one I had pushed aside until now, a conversation from a few months ago when Emily had mentioned, almost casually, that Daniel's parents were considering updating their will, that they were thinking about restructuring things to make everything more efficient, and I had nodded at the time without thinking much of it. But now the words felt different, heavier, connected to something larger I had not fully seen before, and I thought about the way Emily had said it, the careful tone, the slight pause before she added that it was important to plan ahead, and I realized that for the first time I was not just remembering her words. I was listening to them, really listening, and it made me wonder how many other conversations I had let pass without question, how many small clues I had overlooked because I trusted her completely, because I believed that whatever direction her life took, I would always have a place in it that could not be replaced. And I set the glass down gently, the sound soft but final, and I walked to the living room, sitting down in the same chair I had occupied for years, the one by the window where the afternoon light used to fall just right, and I folded my hands together in my lap, looking again at the bracelet, at how easily it could be removed, how little it meant in any practical sense, and yet how clearly it spoke now, not as a simple gift but as a message I could no longer ignore. And I did not feel the need to call Emily, did not feel the urge to ask questions or demand explanations, because something inside me had already shifted into a different kind of understanding, one that did not rely on what she might say, but on what she had already shown me. And as the room grew darker and the quiet settled more deeply around me, I made a decision that did not require anger or confrontation, only clarity, and for the first time in a long while, I began to consider what it would mean to stop waiting for her to remember who I was and instead decide, quietly and firmly, what I would do next. I woke up earlier than usual the next morning, not because I had somewhere to be, but because my mind had already moved ahead of me, quietly organizing thoughts I had spent years avoiding. And for a moment, I lay still in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator down the hall and the distant sound of a car passing by outside. Ordinary sounds that suddenly felt sharper, more present, as if I had stepped into a version of my life where everything was just a little more defined. And when I finally sat up, the bracelet slid slightly against my wrist, a soft plastic shift that reminded me it was still there, still saying what it needed to say without a single word. And I stood, walked to the bathroom, and looked at myself in the mirror, really looked, not just at the surface but at the woman behind it. The one who had spent decades being careful, being patient, being the person who made things easier for everyone else. And I noticed something unfamiliar in my expression, not sadness, not anger, but a kind of steadiness I had not seen before, as if something inside me had finally settled into place. And I reached down and unclasped the bracelet, setting it gently on the counter, not out of bitterness, but because I no longer needed to wear what it represented. And I got dressed slowly, choosing a simple sweater and a pair of slacks. Nothing special, nothing performative, just something that felt like me. And when I walked into the kitchen, I made my coffee the same way I always did, measuring carefully, waiting for the familiar sound of it brewing. But even that routine felt different now, more intentional, as if I were paying attention to each step instead of moving through it on autopilot. And I sat down at the table with my cup, the morning light filtering in through the window. And I let myself think clearly for the first time without trying to soften the truth. And the more I replayed the night before, the more certain I became that what I had witnessed was not a single moment of thoughtlessness, but the result of something that had been building quietly over time, something shaped by choices, priorities, and perhaps even conversations I had not been part of. And I remembered again what Emily had said about planning ahead, about restructuring, about making things efficient. And I realized that those words did not belong to a casual conversation. They belonged to a mindset, one that viewed relationships and responsibilities through a different lens than the one I had always held. And I stood up, rinsed my cup, and dried my hands carefully before walking to the small desk in the corner of the living room where I kept my documents, my bills, my files, everything I had organized over the years with the same quiet diligence I had applied to raising my daughter. And I opened the drawer, pulling out a folder I had not looked at in some time, one that contained copies of my will, my accounts, the small but meaningful assets I had built and preserved. And I sat down, flipping through the pages slowly, reading each line not as a formality, but as a decision. And for the first time, I asked myself a question I had never needed to ask before, not because I lacked the answer, but because I had always assumed it would remain the same. And as I reached the section that outlined everything I had intended to leave to Emily, I paused, my fingers resting lightly on the paper. And I did not feel anger. I did not feel the need to punish or prove anything. I simply felt clarity, the kind that removes doubt and replaces it with something quieter but far more certain. And I closed the folder gently, placing it back on the desk, not because I was finished, but because I understood that this was not a decision to be made in haste. It was a process, one that required the same patience I had always carried, but this time for myself. And as I stood there, looking around the room that had held so many years of my life, I realized that for the first time, I was not thinking about what Emily expected or what she might say or how she might react. I was thinking about what was right. And that difference, subtle as it seemed, changed everything. I did not rush into anything that morning, and that was intentional, because for most of my life I had been the kind of person who reacted quickly when it came to family, who adjusted, who accommodated, who filled in the gaps without being asked. But this felt different. This required distance, clarity, and a willingness to see things as they truly were instead of how I wished them to be. So I spent the rest of the day doing small, ordinary things that grounded me, folding laundry, watering the plants by the window, organizing the kitchen cabinets that did not really need organizing. And in between those quiet tasks, my mind continued to piece things together, not in a frantic way, but slowly, carefully, like someone assembling a puzzle they had finally decided to finish. And by the afternoon, I found myself sitting at the same desk again, this time with my phone in my hand, scrolling through past messages with Emily, reading them not as a mother looking for connection, but as someone trying to understand a pattern. And it was there, clearer than I expected, the gradual shift in tone, the increasing formality, the way her messages had become shorter, more efficient, often centered around logistics rather than conversation. And I noticed how often she mentioned Daniel's family, how frequently their plans seemed to take priority, how naturally she had begun to speak in terms of we, when referring to them, and you, when referring to me. And I set the phone down slowly, exhaling a breath I had not realized I was holding, because seeing it laid out so plainly removed any last trace of doubt. And just then the phone rang, the sound cutting through the quiet of the room, and for a moment I simply looked at it, letting it ring once, twice, before I reached over and answered, recognizing the name on the screen. It was Linda, an old friend I had known for over 30 years, someone who had seen every stage of my life and never felt the need to pretend otherwise. And her voice came through warm and familiar, asking how my weekend had been, and I hesitated for just a second before answering, choosing my words carefully, not to hide the truth, but to present it without unnecessary weight. And as I told her about the dinner, about the gifts, about the bracelet, there was a brief silence on the other end, the kind that carries more meaning than any immediate response. And when she finally spoke, her tone was calm but direct, not surprised, not dismissive, just clear, and she said something simple that stayed with me. She said that people show you where you stand not through what they promise but through what they consistently do. And I felt something in me settle even further, because it aligned perfectly with what I had already begun to understand. And we talked for a while longer, about ordinary things, about her garden, about the weather, about nothing and everything at the same time. And when the call ended, I did not feel heavier. I felt steadier, as if someone had quietly confirmed what I had already begun to accept. And I stood up, walked back to the desk, and opened the drawer once more, this time not hesitating, not questioning whether I should or should not be doing this, but simply acknowledging that this was the next step. And I took out the folder again, placing it on the desk with deliberate care, and then I reached for a notepad, writing down a name I had not needed to think about in years, a lawyer who had helped my husband and me put everything in order long ago, someone I trusted, someone who understood not just the legal side of things but the importance of doing them properly. And I looked at that name for a moment before setting the pen down, not because I was unsure, but because I understood the significance of what I was preparing to do. And as I sat there, the room quiet around me, the afternoon light beginning to fade, I realized that this was not about reacting to a single moment or proving a point. This was about aligning my actions with the truth I had finally allowed myself to see. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt completely certain that I was no longer waiting to be valued. I was deciding what value meant for myself. I did not call the lawyer immediately, and that was deliberate, because I wanted to sit with the decision long enough to know it was not coming from a place of hurt, but from something steadier, something clearer. So I gave myself another day, moving through my routine with a quiet awareness that everything I did now carried a different weight. And that evening, I found myself standing in the hallway outside the spare bedroom, the one that still held boxes of old photographs and keepsakes I had not sorted through in years, and for reasons I could not fully explain. I opened the door and stepped inside, letting the faint scent of paper and time settle around me. And I pulled one of the boxes down, setting it carefully on the bed before lifting the lid. And inside were pieces of a life I had built with my own hands, photographs of Emily as a child, birthday parties with homemade decorations, school plays where I sat in the front row with a camera, vacations we took when money was tight. But memories were still abundant, and I picked up one photo in particular, Emily at about 8 years old, sitting at the kitchen table with flour on her hands and a smile that reached all the way to her eyes. And I remembered that day clearly. How we had spent hours baking because she wanted to surprise her teacher, how she had hugged me afterward and said I was the best mother in the world, and I sat down slowly, holding that photo a little longer than the others, not because I was clinging to the past, but because I was acknowledging it, honoring what had been real and good without letting it cloud what was true now. And as I continued looking through the box, more memories surfaced, not all of them perfect, but all of them grounded in effort, in care, in a kind of devotion that does not ask for recognition but hopes for it anyway. And I realized that for years I had been measuring my present against those memories, expecting the same warmth, the same connection, without fully accepting that relationships change not just with time, but with choices, and the choices Emily had made were now visible in a way they had not been before. And I placed the photo back in the box, closing the lid gently, not as a gesture of closure, but as a sign of understanding. And when I returned to the living room, I did not feel the heaviness I might have expected. I felt something else, something quieter but stronger, a sense that I was no longer defined by what had been given or taken from me, but by what I chose to do with what remained. And the next morning, without overthinking it, I picked up the phone and made the call, my voice steady as I introduced myself, as I explained that I would like to review and update my documents. And the receptionist scheduled an appointment for later that week, her tone professional, routine, unaware that for me this was not just paperwork. It was a turning point, and when I hung up, I did not feel nervous. I did not second-guess myself. I simply placed the phone back on the table and stood there for a moment, taking in the quiet of the room, and I understood that this was the beginning of something that did not require anyone else's approval, not Emily's, not anyone's, because it was rooted in a clarity I had earned, not through a single moment, but through years of experience that had finally aligned into something undeniable. And as I moved through the rest of my day, preparing a simple lunch, stepping outside to check the mail, noticing the way the sunlight fell across the porch, everything felt just slightly different. Not because the world had changed, but because I had. And for the first time in a long while, I was not waiting for a call, not hoping for a message, not anticipating a gesture that might restore something I now understood had already shifted. I was simply moving forward, one quiet decision at a time, knowing that each one brought me closer to a version of my life that reflected not what I had lost, but what I was finally ready to claim. The appointment was scheduled for Thursday morning, and I arrived 10 minutes early. Not because I was anxious, but because I have always believed that being prepared is a quiet form of respect, both for others and for yourself. And as I sat in the waiting area of the law office, I noticed how familiar everything felt. The neutral colors, the neatly arranged magazines on the table, the soft hum of conversation behind closed doors. It reminded me of the last time I had been there with my husband, years ago, when we had sat side by side making decisions together, thinking in terms of what we would leave behind, never imagining that one day I would return alone, not out of loss this time, but out of clarity. And when my name was called, I stood calmly, smoothing the front of my sweater before stepping into the office, where Mr. Reynolds greeted me with the same measured professionalism I remembered, his handshake firm, his expression attentive. And after a few moments of polite conversation, he asked what had brought me in, and I did not rush my answer. I chose my words carefully, explaining that I wanted to review my current arrangements, that I felt it was time to make sure everything reflected my present circumstances rather than assumptions I had made years ago. And he nodded, not surprised, not questioning, simply understanding that this was a normal part of life, that people change, that situations evolve, and he began to go through the documents with me, line by line, asking clear, precise questions about my intentions, about what I wanted, about who I trusted. And as we moved through each section, I found that my answers came easily, without hesitation, not because the decisions were simple, but because I had already done the work of understanding them. And when we reached the section that named Emily as the primary beneficiary, he paused, looking up at me briefly, giving me the space to consider, to confirm, to change if needed. And I held that moment quietly, not with doubt, but with awareness, recognizing the weight of what it represented. And I thought about everything I had seen, everything I had realized over the past few days, the dinner, the conversations, the patterns that had finally come into focus. And I understood that this was not about reacting to any one of those moments. It was about aligning my decisions with the truth I now recognized, and I spoke calmly, explaining that I wanted to make adjustments, that I wanted to redistribute certain portions to ensure that what I had built would be handled in a way that reflected not just past relationships, but present realities. And Mr. Reynolds listened carefully, making notes, asking for clarification where needed, never inserting his own opinion, simply guiding the process with steady professionalism. And as we continued, I felt no sense of conflict, no internal resistance, only a quiet certainty that this was the right course. And when we finished reviewing the changes, he explained the next steps, the formalities, the signatures that would be required, and I agreed, scheduling a follow-up to finalize everything. And as I stood to leave, he offered a simple remark, not intrusive, not personal, just an observation that these kinds of updates often bring a sense of relief. And I nodded, because he was right. Although relief was not quite the word I would have chosen, what I felt was something deeper, something steadier, a sense that I was no longer holding on to expectations that no longer matched reality. And when I stepped back outside into the daylight, the air felt crisp, the sky clear, and I took a slow breath, not out of necessity, but out of awareness, recognizing that something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. And as I walked to my car, I did not think about how Emily might react. I did not rehearse conversations or imagine explanations, because for the first time, I understood that my decisions did not require permission. They did not need to be justified beyond their own truth. And as I drove away, the road ahead felt open in a way it had not before, not because I knew exactly what would happen next, but because I no longer needed to. I had already taken the step that mattered. The days after that appointment passed with a quiet rhythm that felt unfamiliar at first, not because anything around me had changed, but because I was no longer measuring my time by someone else's attention, and I noticed it in small ways, in how I no longer checked my phone out of habit, in how I allowed conversations to begin and end without wondering if I should have said more, done more, given more. And one afternoon, as I was organizing a stack of mail on the kitchen counter, my phone lit up with Emily's name, and I paused for just a second before answering, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, as if I were stepping into a conversation I now understood differently. And her voice came through light and casual, asking how I was, mentioning how busy things had been, how they were finalizing plans for Patricia's cruise. And I listened without interrupting, letting her speak at her own pace, noticing the way she moved easily through details about someone else's life while offering only a brief, surface-level question about mine. And when she finally paused, I answered simply, telling her I was doing well, that I had been taking care of a few things. And there was a slight shift in her tone, a curiosity that had not been there before, and she asked what kind of things, and I told her, calmly and without emphasis, that I had reviewed my documents, that I was making some updates. And there was a moment of silence on the line, not long, but noticeable, the kind that reveals more than words ever could. And she responded quickly, asking why, saying that everything had already been set up, that there was no need to change anything. And I did not match her urgency. I did not explain or justify. I simply said that it felt like the right time, that I wanted everything to reflect my current decisions. And there was another pause, this one slightly longer, and I could almost hear the shift in her thinking, the recalculation, the way she was trying to understand something she had never needed to question before. And she asked if everything was okay, if something had happened, and I answered truthfully, telling her that nothing unexpected had occurred, that I was simply paying closer attention to things now, and my voice remained even, Steady, not defensive, not emotional, just clear. And that seemed to unsettle her more than anything else, because she was used to a version of me that explained, that reassured, that softened every edge. And when she did not receive that, the conversation changed in a way that was subtle but unmistakable. Her tone became more careful, her words more measured, and she mentioned that they would come by sometime next week, that it had been a while, and I said that would be fine, not with excitement, not with reluctance, just acceptance. And when the call ended, I set the phone down gently, feeling no rush of emotion, no need to analyze what had just been said, because I already understood what mattered, not the words themselves, but the shift beneath them. And over the next few days, I continued with my routine. But there was a new layer of awareness in everything I did, a sense that I was no longer participating in the same dynamic, that something fundamental had changed. And when Thursday came again and I returned to the law office to finalize the updates, I signed each document with a steady hand, reading through them carefully, acknowledging each decision not as a reaction, but as a reflection of what I had come to understand. And when it was done, when the papers were placed neatly into a folder and handed back to me, I held them for a moment before setting them in my bag, aware that what I carried now was not just a collection of legal documents, but the result of a choice I had made for myself, quietly, deliberately, without needing anyone else to agree. And as I walked out of the building once more, I realized that whatever came next, whatever conversations would follow, I was no longer stepping into them from a place of uncertainty. I was standing on something solid, something I had finally allowed myself to claim. Emily arrived the following week, just as she said she would, pulling into the driveway in the late afternoon, her car gleaming in the sunlight as if everything in her world remained polished and untouched. And I watched from the window for a moment before opening the door, not to prepare myself, but simply to acknowledge that this was happening, that the next part of this story was no longer something I needed to anticipate, only something I would meet as it came. And when she stepped inside, she smiled, that familiar expression that used to soften everything. But now I saw it differently, not as warmth, but as something practiced, something that adjusted depending on what she needed. And she hugged me briefly, her arms light, her attention already shifting as she glanced around the room, as if searching for something that had changed, even if she could not yet name it. And we sat down in the living room, the same place where so many conversations had unfolded over the years. But this one felt different from the beginning, quieter, more deliberate, and she began with small talk, asking about the house, about how I had been, mentioning again how busy things had been on her end, and I answered simply, not expanding, not filling the space the way I used to. And it did not take long for her to move to what she really wanted to discuss, her tone shifting slightly as she brought up the documents, asking what exactly I meant when I said I was making changes. And I looked at her calmly, not with confrontation, not with accusation, but with a clarity that did not require either. And I told her the truth, that I had updated my plans, that I had made decisions based on what I believed was right for me now. And she leaned back slightly, her expression tightening in a way she could not fully hide, and she asked why. Again, but this time there was something else beneath the question, something more urgent, more personal. And I did not list reasons. I did not recount the dinner or the bracelet or the moments that had led me here, because those things were not arguments to be presented. They were realizations I had already accepted. And instead, I said something simple, something that carried more weight than any explanation. I told her that I had spent many years giving without question, assuming that what I gave would always be understood, but that I had learned recently that understanding cannot be assumed. It has to be shown. And she was quiet then, her eyes searching my face as if trying to find the version of me she was used to, the one who would soften, who would reassure her that nothing had really changed. And when she did not find it, she shifted again, her voice gentler now, asking if she had done something wrong. And I paused, not because I needed time to think, but because I wanted to choose my words with care. And I told her that this was not about a single action. It was about patterns, about priorities, about what people show over time when they believe no one is paying attention. And I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply spoke with the same calm clarity I had carried since that night at the restaurant. And she looked down for a moment, her hands resting in her lap. And for the first time since she arrived, she did not have an immediate response. and the silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was honest. It held everything that had been left unsaid for too long. And when she finally spoke again, her words were quieter, less certain, and she said she had not realized, that she had not meant for things to feel that way, and I nodded, because I believed that in her own way, that was true, but intention does not erase impact, and I told her that understanding comes not from what we say we meant, but from what we are willing to see once it has been revealed, and we sat there for a moment longer, the space between us no longer filled with assumptions, but with something more real, more grounded, and as she stood to leave, her hug was different this time, not stronger, not longer, but more aware, as if she understood that something had shifted that could not simply be undone. And when the door closed behind her, I did not feel relief or regret. I felt something steadier, something that had been building quietly from the moment I first chose to see things clearly, and I walked back into the living room. The late afternoon light stretching across the floor, and I realized that nothing I had done was meant to punish or withdraw. It was meant to realign, to bring my life back into balance with what was true. And for the first time in a long while, I was not waiting to be chosen. I had already chosen myself. This emotional narrative follows an elderly mother who begins to see the painful truth behind her relationship with her daughter after a quiet, but deeply revealing family gathering. Through subtle moments and powerful realizations, this story explores how love, sacrifice, and expectation can slowly shift into distance and imbalance, making it one of the most compelling family stories for audiences who value realism and emotional depth. As the elderly mother reflects on years of devotion and silent giving, she begins to recognize patterns in her daughter's behavior that reveal where priorities have changed, offering a deeply relatable perspective found in many family stories that unfold not through dramatic conflict, but through quiet understanding. The daughter, unaware of the emotional weight of her actions, represents a modern dynamic where intention and impact no longer align, making this narrative resonate strongly with viewers who follow family stories centered on generational disconnect and unspoken expectations. As the elderly mother moves from confusion to clarity, her journey becomes a powerful example of emotional growth and self-respect, highlighting themes often seen in the most impactful family stories where the turning point is not confrontation but realization. Through careful pacing and a grounded tone, this story avoids exaggeration and instead focuses on authentic human behavior, making it ideal for audiences seeking meaningful and reflective family stories that mirror real life. Ultimately, this narrative is not about conflict, but about understanding one's value, redefining boundaries, and quietly reclaiming control, solidifying its place among unforgettable family stories that stay with the audience long after the story ends. Character 1. Elderly white woman, age around 65. Front-facing portrait. Natural lighting, realistic skin texture. Wearing simple, elegant sweater and pearl necklace. Calm, composed expression with quiet strength. No cartoon, no cartoon. No CGI. No illustration. Cinematic photography style. Neutral indoor background. Character 2. White adult woman, age around 35. Front-facing portrait. Polished appearance with styled blonde hair. Wearing modern, elegant outfit. Confident, controlled expression with subtle distance. Natural lighting, realistic skin texture. No cartoon, no cartoon. No CGI. No illustration. Cinematic photography style.